My guest in Face to Faces today is Alan Knott-Craig, Jr., in case you're wondering. And he is, if you don't know, well-known entrepreneur and author. Alan, great to see you again.
Thanks, nice to chat to you.
What's going on in your life? Just tell me the first things that you think about when you wake up in the morning.
The first thing that I think about is probably getting more internet access out into South Africa. But that's been the thing I've been thinking about for 10 years now. It's just that the lockdown has kind of made it vividly clear to everyone that if you don't have a decent internet connection at home and you can't afford it, you're really going to be left out of the economy, particularly when you have a pandemic and kids can't go to school and people can't go to work. So I'm very lucky. I mean, I have a thing that does get me out of bed in the morning, and I have a business that actually makes money doing that thing. So that's kind of my mission at the moment.
One of your more recent projects, well, it's probably a few years now, is did you get Wi-Fi into the center of Pretoria or something like that?
Yeah, about 7 years ago, we started through a non-profit, we started a project with the municipality in Pretoria. It was called Tshwane Free Wi-Fi. And the idea was that anybody living in a township should be within 1 kilometer of a public free Wi-Fi zone funded by the municipality. And it ended up becoming the biggest municipal Wi-Fi project in Africa, like a landmark around the world, in fact, for how municipalities can take responsibility for internet access. And I guess in times like this, it's kind of showing quite visionary, because that network is now pumping. I mean, all those people living in Mamelodi and Shoshongove, they don't have internet at home and they can't afford mobile data. So they get the kind of municipal free Wi-Fi.
What is where I see that a whole bunch of bandwidth or whatever it's called, spectrum, has been freed up recently. But what do we do to make this last beyond just a project or a set time? What's the way forward? A quick conversation with Prof. Jansen the other day, and that's one of his biggest concerns about why education is not going to be more freely available, particularly on this continent.
Yes, as Professor Jansen points out a lot, until you've got universal access to broadband, there's going to be a digital divide in education. But I've just written co-authored a book on the history of telecommunications. And if there's one thing we can learn from history, is that we don't learn from history. It's quite clear to me that in the past, it was never the state that intervened and led to a communication revolution. In fact, it was always when the state got involved that things got held back. For instance, the French were the first country to invent the telegraph. So the very first telecommunications technology in the world ever was invented in France, around about the time of Napoleon. And Napoleon saw it as such a useful tool for his armies that he nationalized it. And then they used the telegraph to actually have a competitive advantage over the other armies. But because it was nationalized, they stopped innovating. And later on, Samuel Morse from America, his little standard ended up dominating. Only 50 years after the French had already started, and America ended up dominating the telegraph standards of the world. So, I don't think we should be waiting for a handout from the government and the government's going to somehow miraculously give us spectrum and it's all going to be solved. In fact, I think as soon as government gets involved, things stop. And in fact, things get more expensive for the consumer. In my opinion, wireless is not going to be the future. If you do the economics of data, then wireless data, whilst extremely convenient, will never give you the lowest cost per gig for moving a gig from A to B. Literally the lowest cost by an order of magnitude is optical fiber. So if you're really going to bring affordable internet, fast internet to everyone in South Africa and the world, you have to be thinking along the lines of optical fiber, putting fiber into the home for everybody in South Africa.
How can you do something that when we have such huge geographical divides? How can we possibly get it into some little rural village miles and miles and miles from anywhere?
That's a good question. Do you know what percentage of South Africans have piped water?
Shock me.
87%.
Wow.
87% of South Africans have piped water, hot and cold, to their house. Well, obviously not hot, but they can put a geyser in. Now that is difficult infrastructure. You need a dam, you need piping, you need sluices. There's an enormous amount you need rain, you need to pray for rain. Now, if you think about the technical challenges of fiber, it's a lot easier. You don't have to worry about water in the first place. And fiber is a fraction of the cost, a fraction of the size of a water pipe. So it's not at all unfeasible to think that every single home in South Africa could get fiber. It's just a question of, is it going to be the state that does it, or is it going to be private sector? And if it is the private sector, what can the state do in order to make it easier for the private sector to do it?
So I suppose you can stick fiber in a water pipe, can you?
No, you can't. Look, water pipes are not the appropriate type of thing. It's just too much space. But
no,
the best place
I'm just thinking if you've got 87% already.
Yeah. The best place to put fiber is on a pole outside your house. Just like you used to have a telecom line, and nowadays everyone's got electricity out their house. I mean, go to any township in South Africa. There are poles everywhere, and there's spider lines of electricity going into every shack. You string up your fiber along the exact same infrastructure, and you've got the solution.
You're doing something at the moment, aren't you, to help people during the lockdown get fiber? Tell me about that.
Well, my children go to a government school in Stellenbosch. It's called Renish Primary School. And a lot of the children there live in townships. And now that the lockdown's been extended, the school has had to put all of its classes online on Google Classroom. And the principal immediately realized that a lot of the kids in Kaimandi, the township nearby, just don't have internet access. So they literally can't keep up with class. So he asked me whether we could help. And we came up with a short-term solution where we actually pay for Vodacom 3G modems with Wi-Fi in it to basically dropped off at each one of these families, and we just remotely load it with airtime as they run out of airtime. It's an extremely effective short-term solution, but in the long term, it's ridiculously expensive. It's literally impossible for that to be the long-term solution for home internet. But at least for the next 6 weeks for the lockdown, the Renish children that can't afford internet at home can stay up with the curriculum. And as the principal, Gary Skills, points out, if they don't make a plan for those kids are going to fail.
But then let's just extrapolate your kids' school. What can we do? How do we do it? And, there's been so much criticism of the and a sensitive one for you, bearing in mind your surname. But the mobile companies are made probably close to trillions. So how can we get them or others or the private sector or the government? How do we get everybody to say, it is such a priority to get the kids able to learn regardless of where they live? I make you the Minister of Communications tomorrow. What do you do?
No, look, it's a good question. I don't think you really need to go. You don't have to convince anyone. I mean, I don't know anybody with half an inch of empathy and half a brain that doesn't think what you just said now is an essential thing. Whether it's Vodacom or it's SAB or whether it's the minister. It's just a question of how. And the mobile operators, MTN and Vodacom are not evil. They're staffed with human beings like you and I. They have families, they have children, they can see the problems in South Africa. They just can't profitably provide internet at a price point that is affordable for most South Africans. Now, that's just because it costs so much money to roll out a mobile network. It's got base stations all the way from Pretoria to town, a long way away. And they have to subsidize those base stations with money that comes out of the metro areas. So it's not that they're ripping us off. It's that their cost models are too high to make affordable retail prices. So, what actually happened, if you look at the history of telecoms, again, one of the interesting things I noted was in the beginning, it was all about data. There was never such a thing as voice for telecommunications. It was always telegraphs and telegrams and faxes, etc. And then there's been this period of about 100 years where voice was very important. Voice. It wasn't 100 years, less than that. Voice. But voice is disappearing because as soon as you've got decent data on your Wi-Fi, on your 3G, you don't make a normal phone call. You make a WhatsApp call, which is pure data. It's just a voice over IP. So we're going back to data. And if we just acknowledge that it's all the future of telecommunications is data networks, and that fiber optic cables is the only way to get there, then I think what the government can do is try to figure out ways to make it super easy for private sector to roll out fiber, no matter where it is, which means issue way leaves, and probably just, don't cause any problems, don't license this stuff. Just make sure the guys can put in the infrastructure without too many delays. And then people will be able to get affordable Wi-Fi at home.
In other words, drop the red tape and let's get on with surviving.
And, I want to be fair to South Africa. I mean, we don't have a lot of red tape, luckily. We do have a little bit of red tape. It's not like the Wild West in Nigeria or anything like that. But if you were to compare our market to the UK, for instance, or any European Union country or Singapore, we've got no red tape. I mean, in countries like that, even though we have electricity and security problems in South Africa, it's still 1/3 of the cost of deploying infrastructure here, simply because there's so much less red tape.
Okay. I have two more thoughts before I leave you to get on with your lockdown, your personal lockdown. Firstly, while I'm asking the question, can you pull up that cover of the new book you were telling us about? Because I'd like people to see that and be able to access it. And then my final question, once you're doing that, because I'm sure brilliant, there it is. So who's John that you wrote with?
He's an acquaintance of mine that I met 2 years ago, and he lives in the UK. And he had a lot of data, and between the two of us, we put together this very boring nerd book for telecommunications. So if you're a nerd for telecoms, this is a nice, interesting read.
Okay, thank you for that. My final question today. You mentioned something to me a little earlier, and it was spirituality. It's weird because more and more every day am I convinced that it's got nothing to do with me, that there's definitely a preordination or whatever. Tell me what you were saying earlier.
I'm not, I'll say I've had too many lucky breaks in my life to not think that there's some kind of plan. But that said, what the lockdown is teaching a lot of South Africans, including myself, is you have to just let go. You have to let go of circumstances. You have to literally believe, have true faith in what's going to happen in the future, that the future, in fact, is going to be positive. Because if you look at the facts of South Africa right now, it's pretty much Armageddon-like. And on that basis, you should just get the hell out of the country. But it's definitely not going to be Armageddon. I mean, there are at least 3 or 4 scenarios that are excellent scenarios. In fact, there's a scenario where South Africa is the best place in the country to be living for the next decade, the best country in the world to be living for the next decade. But to do that, you need to have faith, and you have to let go, and you have to believe.
Well, I think it's been an incredible time in the truest sense of the word for all of us. Thanks for your time now. We'll stay in touch and get going on trying to force some hands on getting that data to the people who really need it.
Thank you, Stuart. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Alan.